Hello, I'm Richard Parrish, Professor of Sports Law at Edge Hill University. I'm going to discuss the key themes developed in our report called The Development of an EU Sport Diplomacy. Now, this was a team effort, co-authored by colleagues from the National University of Physical Education and Sports in Romania, Carlos III University of Madrid, and my university, Edge Hill University in the United Kingdom. The report has three sections. The first looks at developments in EU sport diplomacy to date. In 2009, the Lisbon Treaty committed the EU to develop the European dimension in sport and to, quote, foster cooperation with third countries and the competent international organisations in the field of education and sport. Later, in 2015, European Commissioner Navratilova established a high-level group on sport diplomacy, and it issued its report in 2016, which set out a series of recommendations on how the EU can act more strategically in the area of sport diplomacy. Then the Council adopted Council conclusions on sport diplomacy under the auspices of the Slovak presidency, which called on the European Union to be more proactive in this area. And then the Commission in 2016 and 17 staged a number of high-level conferences on sport diplomacy and published a study on sport diplomacy called Identifying Good Practices. The Commission then took a number of practical steps to progress the sport diplomacy agenda. It entered into an agreement with sports bodies such as UEFA. It embedded sport within agreements with China and Japan. And it made some technical adjustments to the Erasmus scheme to encourage participation from non-EU states. Then, and most recently in 2021, the Portuguese presidency of the EU held a ministerial debate on sport diplomacy and staged a two-day sport diplomacy conference, the theme being promoting Europe's interests and values in the world. The second part of our report looked at the strengths of the European Union as a sport diplomacy actor. First, Europe has a great sporting heritage. As Stuart Murray said about the Australian experience, why, if sport is so prominent in Australian history, culture and society, has it only recently begun to figure in Australia's diplomacy, which after all is about representing a nation's culture and values in the international relations system? Now, of course, the same is true of the European Union. Second, the European Union member states are beginning to define their own sport diplomacy strategies, and the EU can add considerable value to these national strategies. Third, the EU is developing as an international actor. No longer can it be characterised as an economic giant, but a political dwarf. It is developing its own foreign policy, and sport can and should play a role in this. It also has a number of existing budgets, such as the Erasmus scheme. Now, the Erasmus programme is already the epitome of EU educational diplomacy, so why shouldn't it do the same to sport? And the EU has existing strengths in cultural and educational diplomacy, and the EU can learn a great deal from practice in these areas in relation to sport. The third aspect of our report looked at the challenges that the EU is facing in terms of being a diplomatic actor in the field of sport. First, we need to look at the relations with sports bodies. A number of high-profile sports law cases reveal that the EU and sport are, at times, uneasy bedfellows. Second, how can the EU, with 27 member states, speak with one voice in terms of sport diplomacy? Is it necessary to speak with one voice? But sport poses challenging questions for political institutions. Even if the EU wants to develop its own brand of people-to-people diplomacy, how can it ignore the big political questions, sporting sanctions, sporting boycotts, etc.? Third, how should the European Union frame its sport diplomacy message? In its cultural diplomacy, the EU has often portrayed itself as a cultural superpower. The message of superiority might be counterproductive in relation to sport. What about its internal messaging? Does the European Union want to use sport as a vehicle for Europeanisation? Will the public see this as legitimate? And finally, how to develop an organisational culture of sport diplomacy within the EU institutions this is a crucial aspect. How, in a complex and multi-layered organisation, can sport diplomacy be mainstreamed, and how can turf wars be avoided? Our next report will explore the national sport diplomacy strategies of the 27 member states. This is crucial because if the EU sport diplomacy is to succeed, it must add value to these national approaches.